The Mississippi Delta in the early 20th century stretched endlessly under a heavy sun, its flat fields of cotton shimmering in the humid air. Along dusty roads lined with sharecroppers' shacks, life moved to the rhythm of the growing season. In 1917, in Montgomery County, a child named Fannie Lou Townsend was born into this world, the youngest of 20 children, to parents who worked the land for white landowners under a system that kept them bound to poverty. Her family's home was a simple, weathered structure, without electricity or running water, where the smell of wood smoke and boiled vegetables filled the small rooms. From her earliest days, Fannie Lou understood that her world was defined by cotton rows and the constant struggle for survival. By the age of 6, she was already picking cotton in the fields, her small fingers learning to pull the bolls without tearing the fibers, working alongside her family from sunrise until dusk. The plantation bell rang before dawn, and its echo carried across the flat landscape, a signal that another day of labor had begun. Education for Black children in the Delta was a luxury the system did not willingly provide. The one-room schoolhouse Fannie Lou attended was a spare wooden building with rough-hewn benches, open to the drafts of winter and the stifling heat of late summer. The school term was short, often lasting only a few months, because the demands of the harvest came first. Still, young Fannie Lou showed a quick mind and a love for reading, devouring the few worn books available and memorizing Bible verses that would later become a source of strength. Her formal schooling ended after the 6th grade, a common fate for sharecroppers' children who were needed full-time in the fields. Yet the seeds of her powerful oratory were planted there, in the quiet moments when she recited passages aloud, her voice carrying over the cotton plants. The landscape of her childhood was one of stark contrasts. The beauty of the Mississippi sky at sunset, painted in deep oranges and purples, against the harsh reality of a society built on racial caste. Jim Crow laws governed every aspect of daily life, from separate water fountains to the constant threat of violence for any perceived transgression. The plantation store, where workers bought supplies on credit at inflated prices, ensured that families remained in debt year after year, a cycle designed to replace slavery with a new form of economic bondage. As Fannie Lou grew into adulthood, she married Perry Pap Hamer in 1944, and the couple worked on the Marlowe plantation near Rollville. They lived in a small, unpainted house surrounded by fields that stretched to the horizon, where the rustle of cotton stalks was a constant companion. The Hamers were known as hardworking and reliable. Fannie Lou also served as the plantation's timekeeper, a role that required literacy and earned her a measure of respect. But the respect was always conditional, granted only as long as she remained within the narrow bounds defined by white supremacy. The plantation was a self-contained universe, with its own rhythms and rules. In the early mornings, women wrapped their heads in cloths to protect against the sun and dust, while men sharpened hoes and hitched mules. The work was backbreaking, but there was also a sense of community, with neighbors sharing what little they had and singing spirituals to pace the labor. These songs, born of suffering and hope, would later become a hallmark of Fannie Lou Hamer's activism. In the quiet of the evening, she would sit on her porch, looking out at the darkening fields, and hum melodies that spoke of a better world beyond the Delta. The Jim Crow system that surrounded her was not merely a set of laws, it was a daily assault on dignity. Voting was a right reserved for white citizens, enforced by poll taxes, literacy tests, and outright intimidation. Black people who attempted to register risked losing their jobs, their homes, and their lives. The county courthouse, a stately brick building with white columns, symbolized a democracy that excluded her. Inside, officials with stern faces administered impossible tests, while outside, the names of those who tried to register were published in local newspapers, marking them for reprisal. Despite the oppression, there were undercurrents of resistance. Traveling preachers and visiting relatives brought news of the burgeoning civil rights movement, and the radio sometimes carried speeches from distant leaders. In the fields, workers exchanged whispered stories of people who had stood up, even if the outcomes were often tragic. Fannie Lou absorbed these stories, storing them away as she continued her daily routine. She had no formal political education, but her deep sense of justice was rooted in her Christian faith and her lived experience of inequality. By the early 1960s, the Delta remained a place of profound beauty and entrenched injustice. The Mississippi River, a few miles to the west, flowed with ancient indifference, its levees holding back the waters that periodically flooded the lowlands. The soil was rich and dark, capable of producing abundant crops, yet the people who worked it remained hungry. Fannie Lou Hamer was now in her mid-40s, with a weathered face and hands that told the story of decades of labor. She had no reason to believe her life would change dramatically. The plantation system seemed immovable, as permanent as the cypress trees in the swamps. But change was coming, carried on the voices of young organizers who were fanning out across the South. The stage was set for a transformation that would pull a sharecropper from the cotton fields onto the national stage. In the quiet of a Delta evening, with the scent of honeysuckle in the air and the stars emerging one by one, the roots of a remarkable journey were already deep in the ground. The summer of 1962 draped itself over the Mississippi Delta like a heavy, familiar blanket. The cotton fields, stretching endlessly under a pale blue sky, were quiet in the midday heat, the plants heavy with bolls that would soon demand aching backs and bleeding fingers. For Fannie Lou Hamer, now 44 years old, the rhythm of life had been the same for decades. The plantation bell before dawn, the long rows, the sharecropper shack with its worn floorboards, and the ever-present knowledge that her life was not her own. She had worked on the Marlowe plantation near Rollville since she was a child, her body marked by labor and poverty, her spirit somehow unbroken despite a system designed to crush it. In the evenings, she might sit on the porch, watching the fireflies blink in the dusk, humming a hymn softly, the notes carrying a weariness that was also a form of endurance. One evening, word spread through the community about a meeting at the Williams Chapel, a small, unassuming church that served as a sanctuary for the Black community. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNC, was coming to talk about voting rights. Fannie Lou, curious and perhaps sensing a shift in the air, decided to attend. She walked the dusty road with others from the plantation, their footsteps muffled, their voices low. Inside the modest wooden church, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and the flickering light of oil lamps. The young SNC organizers, some of them not much older than the children she had raised, spoke with a fervor that was both foreign and compelling. They talked about the Constitution, about the 15th Amendment, about the simple, radical idea that she, Fannie Lou Hamer, a Black sharecropper in Mississippi, had the right to vote. It was a revelation, a crack of light in a long-sealed room. She had never known, had never been told, that such a right existed for people like her. That night, something shifted within her. The words she heard were not just abstract ideals, they were a direct challenge to the life she had been forced to live. She had always felt a deep, quiet anger at the injustices around her, the stolen wages, the arbitrary rules, the constant threat of violence, but now she had a name for it and a path forward. When the SNC workers asked for volunteers to go to the courthouse in Indianola and attempt to register, Fannie Lou's hand went up. She was not a woman who made decisions lightly, but once made, her commitment was absolute. On August 31, 1962, she boarded a bus with 17 others, a mix of hope and fear palpable in the air. The journey through the flat, sun-baked landscape felt longer than it was, the familiar fields now seeming to watch them pass. At the courthouse, they faced the literacy test, a deliberately confusing and impossible barrier designed to fail them. Fannie Lou, with her limited formal education, did her best, but like most of the group, she was told she had failed. The return home was not a retreat but a reckoning. As the bus pulled back into Rollville, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows, the consequences of her courage were already in motion. The plantation owner, W.D. Marlowe, was waiting. He had heard about her attempt to register, and his message was blunt: withdraw your application or leave. For a sharecropper, Leaving meant losing not just a job but a home, a community, and the only life she had ever known. The little house she shared with her husband, Pap, with its tin roof and small garden where she grew vegetables to supplement their meager diet, was suddenly no longer a refuge. She was given no time, no mercy. That very night, she and Pap gathered what they could and left, seeking shelter with friends. The darkness seemed to press in around them, the familiar sounds of crickets and distant dogs now a backdrop to their displacement. In the days that followed, Fannie Lou Hamer could have crumbled. She had lost everything for a principle she had only just learned she possessed. But instead of breaking, she hardened into a resolve that would define the rest of her life. She stayed with neighbors, her few belongings packed in a corner, and she began to speak out. The loss of her home became a kind of liberation. With nothing left to take, she was free to fight. She told anyone who would listen about the literacy test, about the plantation owner's ultimatum, about the fundamental unfairness of a system that punished people for wanting to be citizens. Her voice, rich and resonant from years of singing in church, carried a new authority. She had been baptized by fire, and she emerged not as a victim, but as a warrior. Fannie Lou's transformation was complete when she decided to return to Indianola to try again, and this time, she would not be silent. She began working closely with SNC, traveling to meetings, sharing her story, and encouraging others to register despite the risks. The simple act of attending that first meeting had unlocked a power within her that no beating, no eviction could suppress. She often said later that she was sick and tired of being sick and tired, a phrase that captured the exhaustion of a lifetime of oppression and the fierce determination to end it. The road ahead would be brutal, but in those early days of her awakening, Fannie Lou Hamer planted her feet firmly on the path to justice, her eyes fixed on a horizon that now, for the first time, held the promise of change. The summer of 1963 draped itself across Mississippi like a heavy, damp blanket. The air was thick with humidity and the scent of turned earth. In the small town of Winona, the afternoon sun beat down on the quiet streets, casting long shadows from the brick storefronts. Fannie Lou Hamer and several companions were returning from a citizenship training session in Charleston, South Carolina. The bus ride had been long, and the weariness of travel settled into their bones. They stopped at a modest bus depot, a simple structure with fading paint and a wooden bench out front. The hope they carried from the training, a hope for a future where their votes would count, was a fragile, precious thing. They stepped off the bus, stretching their legs, unaware that this ordinary stop would become a crucible of unimaginable cruelty. Inside the depot, the air was stale and slightly cooler. A few travelers milled about, and the drone of a ceiling fan mixed with the distant chirp of cicadas. The group, tired and hungry, walked to the lunch counter, a simple affair of linoleum and chrome, seeking only a moment of rest and a bite to eat. But this was Mississippi in 1963, and the simple act of sitting down was a transgression. The white waitress looked at them with cold disdain and refused service. A tense silence fell, broken only by the hum of a refrigerated case. Fannie Lou, ever resolute, began to sing a hymn softly, her voice a quiet anchor of faith. The sound was gentle, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of centuries of sorrow and survival. It was this peaceful act of defiance that drew the attention of the local police. The officers arrived not with a flurry of sirens, but with a deliberate, menacing calm. The afternoon light, golden and syrupy, glinted off their badges as they ordered the group to leave. When they hesitated, the situation escalated with terrifying speed. Fannie Lou and her companions were arrested and taken to the Montgomery County Jail. The jail was a low, grim building of weathered concrete, its small windows barred and dark. Inside, the air was close and smelled of sweat and disinfectant. The cells were cramped, with thin mattresses on metal frames. It was here, in the dim, artificial light, that the true price of courage would be exacted. The officers, enraged by her refusal to be cowed, devised a brutal punishment. They ordered 2 black inmates to beat her with a heavy leather strap. When the men hesitated, the officers threatened them, forcing them to comply. The first blow landed with a sickening thud, a sound that seemed to absorb all the air in the room. Blow after blow fell on her back, her legs, her arms. The pain was a white-hot fire, but Fannie Lou did not scream. Instead, she did what she had always done in moments of trial. She sang. Her voice, though strained, rose in a hymn, "This little light of mine," the words a defiant prayer echoing off the cold concrete walls. The beating continued until the strap was slick with blood and her body was a landscape of bruises and swelling. When the inmates could no longer continue, the officers themselves took over, striking her with fists and boots. The attack left her with permanent injuries, a blood clot in her eye, damage to her kidneys, and a limp that would follow her for the rest of her life. When they finally dragged her back to her cell, she could barely move. The pain was a constant, throbbing presence. Yet, in the darkness, she found a reservoir of strength. She heard the terrified sobs of a young companion in the next cell and began to sing again, her voice a fragile thread of comfort and solidarity. The hours passed in a haze of agony and prayer. The next morning, the harsh fluorescent lights of the jail revealed the full extent of the damage. Her body was broken, but her spirit, forged in the crucible of that night, was unbreakable. This harrowing experience, instead of silencing her, propelled her forward. She emerged from the Winona jail not as a victim, but as a powerful witness. Her testimony of the beating, delivered with a raw, unflinching honesty, would soon travel far beyond the Delta, igniting a fire in the hearts of all who heard it. She became a field secretary for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, transforming her personal trauma into a national catalyst for change, her voice a testament to the price of courage. The sweltering Mississippi summer of 1964 was a season of transformation. In the cotton fields, the bolls were fat and white under the relentless sun, but a different kind of harvest was being sown in church basements and community halls. There, Fannie Lou Hamer and a coalition of activists, sharecroppers, and ministers were building something unprecedented, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. The MFP was born from the exclusion of Black citizens from the state's all-white Democratic Party. Its creation was an act of meticulous, grassroots organizing. In small, clapboard churches with hand-painted fans stirring the thick air, they held precinct meetings. At long tables covered with oilcloth, they registered voters and elected delegates, following every rule to the letter. The process was slow and deliberate, a testament to the belief that democracy must be built from the ground up. Fannie Lou, with her powerful voice and unshakable faith, became the heart of this movement, traveling down dusty roads to gather the hopes and signatures of people who had been told for generations that their voices did not matter. As the August sun beat down, they prepared to take their fight to the national stage. The delegation traveled to Atlantic City, New Jersey, where the Democratic National Convention was held in the cavernous, echoing Boardwalk Hall. The contrast was stark, the salty sea breeze and neon lights of the boardwalk against the deep, rural roots of Mississippi. Inside the hall, the air was charged with political maneuvering, the scent of cigar smoke and perfume mingling with the weight of history. The MFP came not to ask for a favor, but to claim their rightful seats, arguing that the all-white regular delegation was illegally elected because it had systematically excluded Black voters. They brought with them meticulous records and, most powerfully, their own lived experiences. The moment came when Fannie Lou Hamer was called to testify before the Credentials Committee. The television cameras, massive and cumbersome, were trained on her. She sat down, her posture dignified, her hands folded. The room fell silent. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it filled every corner of the hall and millions of living rooms across America. She began to recount, in simple, devastating detail, her attempt to register to vote. She spoke of losing her job, of being evicted from the plantation where she had lived for 18 years. Then, her voice steady but heavy with emotion, she told the story of the Winona jail. She described the brutal beating, the permanent damage to her body, the cold concrete floor. The nation watched, transfixed, as an ordinary woman from the Mississippi Delta laid bare the violent soul of American apartheid. The testimony was so raw and powerful that President Lyndon B. Johnson, fearing its impact, hastily called a press conference to pull the television networks away. But it was too late. Her words had already seared into the public consciousness. In the aftermath, a political storm erupted. The party leadership, desperate to avoid a walkout by Southern delegations, offered a compromise. The MFP would receive 2 non-voting, at-large seats, while the all-white delegation would be seated. It was a patronizing offer, a pat on the head. In a cramped hotel room, the MFP delegates gathered to debate. The air was thick with tension and the smell of stale coffee. Many national civil rights leaders urged them to accept, calling it a victory. But Fannie Lou Hamer stood firm. Her voice, though weary, was clear. "We didn't come all this way for no 2 seats," she said, "when all of us is tired." The room fell silent. Her words crystallized the moral choice before them. They had not come for a token gesture. They had come to be recognized as full citizens. Inspired by her courage, the delegation rejected the compromise. They did not get their seats that year, but they forced a moral reckoning within the Democratic Party. The image of Fannie Lou Hamer, her face a portrait of righteous exhaustion, asking the simple, profound question, "Is this America?" changed the party forever. For years later, Reform Commission mandated that all delegations be open to all voters, a direct legacy of their stand. Her testimony was not just a plea for a seat at the table, it was a declaration that the table itself had to be rebuilt. In the warm, dusty light of a Mississippi morning, Fannie Lou Hamer walked the furrowed fields not as a sharecropper, but as a woman with a vision. The scent of turned earth and the distant hum of cicadas surrounded her as she surveyed the land that would soon become the Freedom Farm Cooperative. It was 1969, and the struggle for voting rights had laid bare a deeper truth. Political power meant little without economic independence. Hamer understood that hunger and poverty were weapons as cruel as any poll tax or literacy test, and she set out to disarm them. She believed that if Black farmers could own land and grow their own food, they could build a foundation of self-sufficiency that no sheriff or politician could take away. The Freedom Farm Cooperative was her answer, a bold experiment in grassroots economics that would buy land, provide housing, and feed hundreds of families in Sunflower County. Hamer's journey to this point had been shaped by the relentless logic of need. In the Delta, sharecropping kept families in a cycle of debt, their labor enriching white landowners while they lived in crumbling shacks without running water. Hamer herself had picked cotton from the age of 6, her hands raw and her back aching, yet she never had enough to save. After her eviction for trying to vote, she knew that civil rights had to include the right to eat. The cooperative model, inspired by similar efforts in Israel and Alabama, offered a way to bypass the plantation system entirely. With donations from supporters across the country, Hamer purchased 40 acres of rich Delta soil and opened it to anyone willing to work. Families could farm plots, share tools, and take part in decision-making, creating a rare space of Black autonomy in a state built on exploitation. At the heart of the cooperative was the pig bank, a project as practical as it was profound. Hamer knew that protein was scarce in poor households, where children often went to bed hungry. She acquired a herd of pigs and lent them to families who would raise them and, in time, return piglets to the bank to be passed on to others. It was a cycle of mutual aid that spread across the county, with the simple goal of ensuring that no child went without a meal. The pig bank was more than charity, it was a statement of dignity, a way for people to provide for themselves without bowing to the white-controlled economy. Hamer often said, "You can't have a healthy mind in a hungry body," and she worked tirelessly to feed both. The cooperative also grew vegetables, operated a commercial kitchen, and even provided affordable housing, making it a lifeline in a region where poverty was deliberately maintained. Even as she built this local movement, Hamer sought to take her fight to the halls of power. In 1964, while the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party challenged the National Convention, she also ran for Congress in the state's 2nd District. It was a symbolic campaign, waged against entrenched white supremacy, but it was also a declaration that Black citizens would no longer accept exclusion from the political process. Standing before crowds in church basements and dusty fields, she spoke with the same fire that had captivated the nation during her DNC testimony. She knew she would not win, but she understood that every ballot cast was a brick in the foundation of a new Mississippi. Her run forced the state to reckon with a Black woman demanding a seat at the table, and it inspired others to imagine a future where representation was real. Yet for all her moral clarity and grassroots success, Hamer's influence within the national civil rights leadership was often constrained. The movement's public face was largely male and middle class, and leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Roy Wilkins operated in a world of press conferences and negotiations that could feel distant from the Delta's dirt roads. Hamer's unpolished accent, her working-class roots, and her gender made her an outsider in circles that valued respectability. She was sometimes sidelined at strategy meetings, her ideas dismissed as too radical or too local. Even within SNC, where she had found her voice, the shift toward Black power and male-dominated rhetoric left less room for her brand of woman-led, community-based organizing. These biases did not silence her, but they limited the resources and platforms she could access, forcing her to build change with her own hands. The Freedom Farm Cooperative, for all its successes, faced constant financial strain. Hamer poured her own speaking fees into the project and spent countless hours fundraising, but the burden was immense. The land needed equipment, the pigs needed feed, and the people needed support that donations alone could not sustain. By the mid-1970s, the cooperative struggled to stay afloat, a victim of the same economic forces it fought against. Yet its legacy was indelible. It proved that poor Black farmers could manage their own affairs, that a woman with no formal education could lead a movement of economic liberation, and that the fight for justice must encompass both the ballot box and the dinner table. Hamer's vision of a cooperative community, where people governed themselves, remained a beacon, even as her health began to fail. In the quiet of a Delta evening, with the sun sinking low over the fields, Hamer would often reflect on the work still to be done. She had seen the inside of jails and the halls of Congress, had been beaten and belittled, yet she never lost faith in the power of ordinary people. The Freedom Farm Cooperative was her testament to that faith, a living rebuttal to a system that said Black lives were worth less. As the shadows lengthened, she might hum a hymn, her voice carrying over the rows of collards and corn, a sound of resilience and hope. Her struggle had broadened beyond the voting booth to the very soil beneath her feet, and in that soil, she planted seeds that would outlast her. The morning light fell softly on the small church in Rollville, Mississippi, where Fannie Lou Hamer's voice had once risen in song and testimony. It was March 1977, and the community gathered to mourn a woman who had been called the spirit of the civil rights movement. The wooden pews, worn smooth by generations of worshippers, held friends and family who remembered her not as a distant icon, but as a neighbor who had shared their struggles and their hopes. Outside, the Delta stretched flat and quiet, its fields dormant in the early spring. Hamer had died of heart failure at the age of 59, her body worn down by years of poverty, brutal beatings, and relentless activism. Yet in that humble sanctuary, her legacy was already taking root, a testament to the power of an ordinary person to change the course of history. Hamer's most visible impact lay in the voting rights she had fought so fiercely to secure. Her televised testimony at the 1964 Democratic National Convention had exposed the raw violence of Mississippi's white power structure to a national audience, helping to build the moral pressure that led to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That landmark legislation, which banned discriminatory voting practices, was a direct response to the sacrifices of Hamer and countless other foot soldiers. In the years that followed, Black voter registration in Mississippi soared from a mere 6% to over 60%, transforming the state's political landscape. Hamer did not live to see the full fruits of this change. the black elected officials, the policy reforms, but she had planted the seeds with her courage and her unyielding demand for justice. Beyond the ballot box, Hamer's work reshaped the very meaning of democracy. She insisted that political participation must be grounded in the daily lives of poor and working people, a philosophy she called bottom-up change. The Freedom Farm Cooperative and the Pig Bank, though eventually dissolved, inspired a generation of community organizers to link civil rights with economic rights. Her emphasis on cooperative economics and local leadership influenced later movements for food justice and community land trusts, and her model of grassroots organizing became a blueprint for activists across the globe. Hamer showed that democracy was not a gift from above, but a practice built in church basements, on front porches, and in the fields where people worked. She taught that every voice mattered, especially those that society tried to silence. Her legacy also endures in the countless individuals she mentored and inspired. Young organizers who worked alongside her in the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party went on to lead their own fights for justice, carrying her lessons into new arenas. She demonstrated that leadership could be rooted in authenticity rather than polish, in moral clarity rather than political calculation. Her famous words, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired," became a rallying cry for those who refused to accept injustice as inevitable. In workshops and classrooms, her story is told not as a relic of the past, but as a living example of what courage looks like. Her face, with its broad smile and knowing eyes, appears on murals and posters, a reminder that power can rise from the most unlikely places. Yet Hamer's legacy is not without its shadows. The limitations she faced, the sexism and classism within the movement, the constant financial struggles, highlight the enduring barriers that grassroots leaders, especially women of color, must overcome. Her contributions were often minimized in the official histories of the civil rights era, which favored charismatic male leaders and dramatic marches over the slow, unglamorous work of building cooperatives and registering voters. It took decades for scholars and activists to fully recognize her role, and even today, her name is less known than those of her male contemporaries. This erasure is a reminder that history is written by the powerful and that the work of reclaiming those stories is ongoing. Hamer's life urges us to look beyond the headlines and honor the quiet labor of community building. In the decades since her death, Hamer's influence has continued to ripple outward. The Voting Rights Act, though weakened by subsequent court rulings, remains a cornerstone of American democracy, and her testimony is still cited in debates over voter suppression. The organizations she helped found, like the National Women's Political Caucus, carry forward her vision of inclusive politics. Her insistence on the interconnectedness of race, class, and gender anticipated the intersectional analysis that would become central to modern social movements. Young activists, from the Black Lives Matter movement to climate justice campaigns, draw strength from her example, seeing in her a foremother who understood that freedom is indivisible. Her voice, captured in recordings, still echoes with a power that transcends time. As the funeral service ended and the mourners stepped into the bright Mississippi sun, they carried with them the spirit of a woman who had transformed her suffering into a force for liberation. The land around them, once a site of exploitation, now held the memory of her freedom farm, where she had dared to imagine a different world. Fannie Lou Hamer's legacy is not a monument frozen in marble, but a living call to action, to vote, to organize, to feed the hungry, and to believe that ordinary people, armed with faith and determination, can bend the arc of history toward justice. In the quiet of that Delta town, her song continued, a melody of hope and defiance that would never be silenced.